Hello, and welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know, a podcast about classical education, the ancient world, and kind of whatever comes into our mind as we just feel like talking about things. My name is Thomas Magby, and I'm joined, as always, by AJ Hannenberg.
That's this guy right here.
And Graham Donaldson.
Hello.
Hello, indeed.
Sorry, just eating an Oreo.
I don't blame you. Thank you for bringing snacks. Guys, I've been thinking recently about getting my portrait taken. I want a just giant painting of myself. Is this a good idea?
It seems like a great idea.
Great. I'm going to get it and then pray that all the bad things that I do just go to the painting. Is this a good idea?
Well, if you get a portrait, we can freeze this moment in time.
Okay.
So that your present beauty will never fade.
Yeah.
I think Thomas gets better as he ages. Maybe is that just me?
Like a fine wine.
Like a fine wine. Like a nice sharp cheddar. You just get better.
Thanks. Wow, and you rhymed.
But there's a tipping point with cheese, though.
As with Thomas. Yeah, naturally. Okay, so today we're talking about Dorian Gray. Have you all seen? So there's a movie, Dorian Gray.
I've seen it.
Yeah, so
I think there's a few different versions.
I've seen whatever painting is in like an old black and white one up in the Metropolitan Museum up in New York. It is an ugly looking,
and it is a terrible movie. Like,
is it really?
It's a black and white one?
Yeah, it's not very good.
I remember watching the black and white one as a child, and it scared the bazonkas out of me. Because when the painting changed and I saw it for the first time, I just couldn't see the stern
Maybe I'm
eyes
thinking
in my
the
mind.
Maybe I'm thinking the new one. Did the
like the color
in
from
your black
ago
and white version? Did it go like when you looked at it? Because in the new version, the painting makes noises.
The painting made noises. I can't remember. The new one, Dorian Gray, is played by Prince Caspian, the same actor who played Prince Caspian in those unfortunate Narnia remakes.
But I haven't watched any of them.
They're pretty bad.
Oh, bummer.
I don't know. I liked them. But then again, I have very low movie standards.
Yes, we have. Hannenberg and I have different
standards.
Both of you are very discerning with your movie choices.
Snooty is the word you're looking for.
I choose to be a little more pandering than that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I'll use the other word. Anyway, let's talk about Endgame for the next hour, guys.
I refuse to watch.
I'm seeing that tomorrow.
There's no way I could.
If it's got explosions,
there's no way
I
could care less about a paint by numbers action movie.
Go watch it tomorrow and find out if you care that little.
I can't even seen the first 23. I haven't even seen the last one where they all die with the purple guys
for a movie from 3 years ago or whatever.
Maybe I think maybe it's just expectations. Like I don't expect for my soul to be filled by this film. I expect to see some really big green men punch some really big purple men, and then I'm totally entertained. Like that's all that I require.
Speaking of expectations for your soul, how about
we get started? Okay. All right, so I can't believe we've made it this many episodes without having done Dorian Gray. Partially because The Picture of Dorian Gray is one of my very favorite books. I think it's great. I really enjoy it. I'm so glad that we teach it now in 12th grade here at Veritas, and most of the people who read it enjoy it just as much.
Hannenberg, I can't remember. What did we get rid of in order to teach The Portrait of Dorian Gray?
What was it? Was it The Wasteland?
Yeah.
Oh, so you got rid of a bad poem to add in a good book, isn't that?
So we got rid of The Wasteland, and I think it was also The Sun Also Rises, wasn't it?
Yeah, but that was based on more of a is this classical?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Can you say that about The Wasteland too?
Sure.
Anyway, sorry.
Sure.
Good.
All right. Let me tell you a little bit about Oscar Wilde before we actually get into the book. The book shouldn't take me that long to explain. There's, I've broken it down into about 12 movements, but it's pretty simple, the plot. But I think the way it interacts with Oscar Wilde himself and the way that story is now interacting with culture is particularly interesting. So, he was born on the 16th of October in 1854. And he lived until the 30th of November, 1900. So he died when he was 46, which is pretty young. That's pretty young. Yeah. There are people who live to 92, and that's only halfway through, right?
44 is?
Gotcha.
I thought you were saying 90. I thought you were talking about living to be 200. Anyway, sorry.
No.
That's incredible.
46 would be halfway through 92, right? He died pretty young. He was born in Dublin, and he was the Dublin, not Dubland.
Okay, yep, good.
I think that's a dubstep club.
Dubland? Oh, man.
Whoop, whoop, whoop. All right, he was born in... He was born in Dublin, the second of three kids, which makes sense. So he had a little middle child syndrome. His mom was an avid writer of poetry. She wrote under the pseudonym Speranza. and she wrote poetry for the Revolutionary Young Islanders in 1848. She was a lifelong Irish nationalist. She wanted Ireland to separate, and so she would read this revolutionary poetry to her sons. And she was always interested in sort of the neoclassical revival. She had Greek busts in her home and was just sort of always interested in classical education, which is kind of awesome.
Yeah.
Right? So Oscar Wilde was taught in his home until he was 9. His dad, William, was an ear and eye surgeon who eventually was knighted for his service as a medical advisor and for working on the census. Man, if I knew I could get a knighthood for just working on the census.
On a census? Like of just like
Counting people.
Counting people?
Yeah.
Oh.
That sounds awesome.
That's an easy way.
1, 2, 3.
I knight you, Graham
4.
Donaldson. Yeah.
5. Wait. 7. Mark it in the book, Philippi. All right. He was baptized as an infant in St. Mark's in Dublin, and he had
Catholic.
3. Yes, Catholic. He had 3 step siblings: Henry, Emily, and Mary. So 6 kids altogether. That's a pretty crazy home. Homeschooled till 9, like I said. He learned French and German from his caretakers, one like a governess and then a French bonne or whatever it is. And so these 2 women would take care of him, and they taught him their languages. So he grew up, having 3 languages and being taught by his poet mother. You can't really ask for a more auspicious beginning for a writer.
Right.
So when he went off to university, he got a scholarship to read the classics at Trinity College in Dublin and shared a room with his older brother, which I'm sure was
problems.
rough. Yeah. As a student, he worked with a professor on his book, The Social Life in Greece. Mahaffey, the professor, was what Oscar considered his first and best teacher. Mahaffey originally boasted of Wilde as a pupil, right? He comes out and is this prolific, fantastic writer, and then later, after Oscar Wilde's fall, would call him the only blot on his tutorship, which is kind of a shame to see someone so proud of you and then so not proud of you anymore.
Yeah.
He went from there to Magdalen College, where he had gotten a scholar. He had won a prize to go and read the greats for 4 years until 1878. There, he became a Mason and rose to the sublime degree of Master Mason.
Seriously?
Wow.
Yeah.
He was a stonemason?
He was a stonemason.
Wow.
He was really active in college, and then after he graduated college, he was like, and just didn't pay his dues, and eventually
There's a classical stuff
lapsed.
episode we got to do.
Masons?
Yeah.
Masonry. Yeah, that'd be cool. I had a Mason neighbor. It was awesome. I woke up
Weird?
I woke up one night
There we go.
at 2 a.m. to the reflection of flames on my window,
Yep.
and was like, fire in the yard. And so I ran, because I saw flames like down on our driveway, and I ran downstairs to find him sitting with a staff meditating in the middle of a flaming circle.
Good for him.
And his girlfriend was like, dude, it's okay.
This is
I got
totally
this.
normal.
And I was standing there in my boxers, like ready for action.
What?
Yeah.
That's a real thing that happened to me.
Man.
That's weird.
Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, so it only
I want
lasted
in.
while he was.
Like, not that I was interested in the first place, but now here we are.
Right. He always considered converting to Catholicism, and for that reason, he often spoke to clergy, and he had an audience with Pope Pius IX. His dad, who was not Catholic, threatened to cut off his funds. Mahaffey, the professor, thought it was a bad idea. He still wanted to do it, but on the day he was supposed to go and sort of officially join and get baptized in the church, he sent flowers instead. He just didn't want to commit to a formal creed. They were altar lilies. So
Really?
I like the pun.
That's funny.
At Magdalen College, he sort of developed his tendency towards aestheticism, and we'll talk more about aestheticism as we sort of move on, but he wore long hair, sort of dandyish clothes. He thought sports were very silly, although he occasionally boxed. He decorated his room with peacock feathers, lilies, china, and just, all sorts of decadence, and would entertain people lavishly. And he had this famous line that would become sort of a motto for the aesthetes. It was, "I find it harder and harder every day to live up to my blue china."
Okay.
And some people found that, his critics found that to be totally vacuous. Right? And he was once physically attacked by 4 students and dealt with them single-handedly, sort of silencing some of the critics that had been, calling him a sissy. And he cultivated his myth, which actually ended up in him getting temporarily expelled for sort of cultivating his own myth. And then he just went to Greece and then came back a little late to college and sort of, did it with all his big flair. He he met Walter Pater in his third year, and Walter Pater argued that man's sensibility to beauty should be refined above all else, right? Each moment should be lived to its absolute fullest extent. And his book was what Oscar Wilde called the book that has had such a strange influence over my life. I think it might be that book that becomes the yellow book in the Picture of Dorian Gray. So there's a book that has a big influence over Dorian in the play, and it says a lot of these sort of strange things. He used to carry it with him. Then he met John Ruskin, a guy who sort of gave this purpose, arguing that the importance of art lies in its potential for the betterment of society. So don't just like art for art. You like art because it helps to develop the person and can eventually help to develop society, right? Beauty must be allied with moral good.
And that's John Ruskin, like, popularized those little quaint houses, the craftsman style.
Really?
Yeah.
He won the 1878 Newgate Prize for his poem Ravenna and graduated with a double first and a Bachelor's of Arts in classical moderations and the greats. So he was classically educated, this guy.
Awesome.
He read all the Greeks. He knew Iliad, Odyssey. Like, that was what he practiced in college. That and decorating with peacock feathers.
The important things.
Yeah. After college, he went back home and hooked back up with Florence Balcombe, who was his childhood sweetheart, and he was like, we had such a great time together, and they were together for a while. Eventually, she would leave him and marry Bram Stoker, the guy who wrote Dracula.
Yeah.
So apparently there's something wonderful about this woman, Florence Balcombe. Like, there's just something magnetic that draws in all the writers. Maybe it's her spelling, I don't know what it is, but to land not only Oscar Wilde and have him obsessed with you, but then to land later Bram Stoker, I feel like that's a win,
My
right?
takeaway is that she must be total weirdo, like that those are the two that those are the two guys who are interested in
I'm
her.
just picturing Helena Bonham Carter.
Okay.
Oh, I can see that. All right, that makes sense. So he returns to England in 78, so a short jump back home. He tries to get a position in the classics in Oxford or Cambridge. And that's, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of kids who graduate school and they don't know anything else to do except try to do more schools.
Yes, true.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of an automatic thing for kids when they leave college, right? I felt aimless when I graduated, and so doing what you've been doing this whole time, just learning and teaching, makes sense.
Yeah.
He had all along been sort of published in little bits. He went to London to get himself established as a sort of a bachelor, spent the last of his inheritance there. And he published in 1881 his poems, or collected poems. It was pretty well received, prompted a second printing. It was bound in rich enamel parchment cover, had a gilt blossom on the cover,
of course,
printed on handmade Dutch paper. And for a long time, he would give it as gifts to dignitaries that he met and that sort of thing. The Oxford Union, by the way, rejected it and wouldn't allow it in their library because in a very tight vote, they vote that it was guilty of plagiarism.
Oh, wow. That's bad.
And not all the critics like it. This magazine called Punch said, the poet is wild, but his poetry is tame, which is
That's pretty good.
The Brits.
Yeah.
All right. He went on a short lecture tour in the US in 82. Pretty well received, although the press was not a fan. In 83, he went back to Paris. 84, back to London, where he married the woman Constance Lloyd. She was a woman of fairly ample means. She had a pretty decent allowance for a young woman, which would probably be around 40 grand, I think, today. It was about 25,000 pounds in today's money. What's the pound going for, Graham? You might know.
It's low now. It's like, what, $1.30?
Like $1.30, so maybe about 40 grand. So 25 times 1 point, whatever.
What is it, Thomas?
129. So $32,500 if we're converting.
32.5.
Yeah.
Okay, so about there.
Yeah.
So on her, allowance.
I'm just thankful we were very specific with that number.
So I mean, you put it in perspective.
Even though it was
right?
100 years ago, but
Exactly.
whatever.
That's in today's money. 100 years ago it was like 250 pounds.
Oh, I see.
It was very little.
Okay.
So they sort of used all that money to furnish their apartment lavishly and grandly, and Oscar Wilde had very expensive taste. Gotta make your place look good if you are going to espouse as a way of life being surrounded by beautiful objects and being surrounded by art and sort of living art out into the real world. You gotta spend some money on what your apartment looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So he this is about when he met a guy named Robert Ross. Now, Robert Ross was a young 17-year-old homosexual who was determined to seduce Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde at this point, his wife had just had a second kid, and he was finding himself physically repulsed by her. and so was open to the advancements of this young man, Robert Ross. He did get seduced, and then he would sort of continue this relationship with Robert Ross for a really long time. During this time, he also edited a magazine called The Woman's World, which was great for a while, and then ultimately he sort of got bored of the actual real work that it takes to make a magazine, like running an office and doing editing, and like all of that stuff was boring for him. He liked to write and sort of be lavish, and so he left, and Woman's World died one issue after he left. It outlived him by a single issue. He wrote essays and poems, et cetera, and then in 1890 he published The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was instantly lambasted for being overtly homosexual, right? There were
because the version. So when we read the book now, it's an edited version of that original one. Correct?
Yeah, we typically don't read the original version. Yeah, you can get. I think
that makes it sound like it's some night and day thing. The edited version is not all that much edited from the original.
It's true. I think in our book we actually have both.
We've got both,
really?
and we've read them both for when we were considering this book, and either one is. I mean, one's not that much more
veiled.
Yeah.
There are a few expanded chapters, but in the current version of it's there are undertones in there. There's some hints at it, but it's certainly not overt, and it doesn't promote anything. It doesn't discuss it directly. It just sort of hints at things.
And that's what's in the original version.
Yeah, even in both of them, it is that way.
Yeah. Okay. So he edited it and then re-released it with a brand new introduction, a foreword, which I will read a little bit to you. He released that in 91, and it was fairly well received. He went to Paris, wrote a few plays. The one play he wrote in Paris, Salome, would not go perform because it depicted biblical characters, and they were not going to have that on their stage. Then he wrote Lady Windermere's Fan, and everybody loved Lady Windermere's Fan. It was great. It was performed in London. In mid-91...
Probably still performed in London.
Yeah.
Yeah. In mid-91, he met Lord Alfred Douglas, who was young and handsome and spoiled, and they had a tempestuous affair. They were reckless in public. They were together all the time. Wilde would often explain away their relationship as the sort of thing between like David and Jonathan, right? Greek love, right? So between an older man and a younger man, that there would have these developing relationships, and that's sort of how he would explain it. Like, society just doesn't get it. But in truth, there were some pretty sketchy things going on. Lord Alfred Douglas initiated him into the underground world in London of gay prostitution. So they would bring a working class young man, and Oscar would wine him, dine him, and then go to bed with him. And the danger of having, a working class stranger be the one that you are going to bed with was part of the draw for Oscar Wilde. The problem was Lord Alfred Douglas had a father, and Lord Alfred Douglas's father was a hot-headed fellow. He was the guy who invented the modern rules of boxing.
Oh, wow.
Right. So he's the kind of guy you don't really want to mess with.
Yeah.
And so he would often, get really angry with Oscar, and Oscar would try to mollify him because he can't just say, screw you and I'll do whatever he wants to, because this father would take things public, and he doesn't really want to let go of Lord Alfred. And so he's kind of caught in this weird familial fight. And Lord Alfred said notoriously one time, "I do not say that you are it, but you look it and you pose at it, which is just as bad. And if I catch you and my son again in any public restaurant, I will thrash you."
Wow.
So it's pretty intense. In 1984, The Importance of Earnest comes out to the Importance of Being Earnest, another play, comes out to an excellent reception, and 15 weeks later, he is in prison. So what happened was, in 1895, Lord Alfred's dad leaves a card at one of the clubs that says, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." He meant sodomite. It was just a misspelling, but posing sodomite. And that was almost a public declaration, right? Mm-hmm. So Wilde decides to prosecute him for criminal libel. So just because it's been this public thing. And the problem is that the only way to exonerate yourself for public libel is to prove that your statement is actually true. Right. So he put the Lord Alfred's dad in this position where the only way that he could exonerate himself from this crime was to actually prove that Oscar Wilde was a sodomite. And digging into Oscar Wilde's past, he obviously found ample evidence. So they went to trial, and eventually when they found some of the prostitutes that Wilde had interacted with, he balked and dropped the case. But a few days later, of course, they came out with charges against Wilde himself for public indecency and sodomy and that sort of thing, and took him to
solicitation.
court. Solicitation and all, he went for all sorts of things. And in court, he was sometimes flippant. He was witty. He didn't take it as seriously as perhaps he needed to. He lied about his age when he was under oath, and they would bring that back again and again and again to hurt him. And so here's one quote. So he said, someone claiming that works of art are not capable of being moral or immoral, but only well or poorly made. So this is what he would claim, and that only brutes and illiterates whose views on art are incalculably stupid would make such judgments about art. So he wasn't exactly making friends, right? They asked him directly whether he had ever kissed this certain kid, and Wilde responded, "Oh dear, no. He was a particularly plain boy, unfortunately ugly. I pitied him for it." And then, of course, they would press him and say, "Why was his ugliness relevant? Right? Why does his ugliness matter?" And he's like, "You're using my words, and I spoke flippantly, and I should have spoken more seriously." So he, a lot of those slips and all of the evidence all mounting up, he eventually sort of said, "I am my own prosecutor in this case." Right? He sort of sunk his own ship. And then they were going to arrest him, and he could have fled. His whole family was sort of encouraging him to flee. I think his mom wanted him to stay and fight it, but eventually he was arrested and charged and then sentenced to 2 years of hard labor amid cries of shame from the entire courthouse.
Right.
And then he would go to this hard labor. And you guys want to guess what his hard labor was?
I have no idea. Do you know?
He had to run on a treadmill.
Seriously?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, he walked on a treadmill. I imagine it was working some sort of piece of machinery, and separate fibers and old ropes.
Okay.
That was his job.
It sucks.
I guess it doesn't sound... When I hear hard
It's not like
labor...
Jean Valjean or anything.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like you're sent to the mines or something, but so it doesn't sound that bad.
That one wasn't so bad. He did have very limited reading there, right, where it was just, I think, the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress. And then he moved to Wandsworth, where it was far worse. He collapsed eventually from hunger and illness and ruptured his eardrum on the way down, and spent, I think it was like 2 months in the infirmary, which was really hard. And then eventually he requested some books and got some actual decent access. I think after his sickness, he was transferred to Reading Jail. You guys know Reading? It's not
Reading.
a pun
Reading.
on. Is it Reading?
It's pronounced Reading.
So Reading Jail, where he eventually got some books, including Dante, stuff by St. Augustine, and there he would write a 50,000-word letter to Alfred Douglas, which he would eventually publish under the name De Profundis, and which really messed with Alfred Douglas to hear all this. There's a lot of personal stuff in there.
Sure.
Part of it was him forgiving Alfred for everything he had done and all of that stuff, and for both of their sakes, but I think there were still some accusations in there. There was one point during the trial when Alfred had told him, like, when you are not on your pedestal, you are not interesting.
Wow.
Which is rough.
Yeah.
That's rough to hear from someone you like. After he was released, he had 3 years of decline before death. During that time, De Profundis was published, his letters were published, and he published The Ballad of Reading Jail, which was sort of an expose on Reading Jail. I always thought Reading Jail because I thought it was a fun pun, but it's
like
not.
That, yeah.
I'd go to Reading Jail.
Yeah, totally. Man,
Reading Jail.
Yeah.
Well, it's not. Reading
that.
Jail sounds like that you just got no good books.
You were in Reading Jail.
All right. Or you have to read like just the Reader's Digest. Like that's it. Actually, I feel like that's not too bad.
Reader's Digest? I don't know.
It's like young adult science fiction novels.
No.
Oh yeah, like Animorphs.
I would do that. Man, sign me up for
Or like
Animorphs.
only Goosebumps books.
Sign me up for R.L. Stein. That's my boy.
I read like 4 Goosebumps books in a day once time. I wanted to set a record.
Yeah, yesterday. I heard it.
Yes, not yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. Awkward.
So he goes to Paris, never to return to London. And people do visit him. He's reunited with Douglas in 1899 or 97. I think it's 99. And their families did not agree with this, so eventually they were separated after they spent some time in Naples. Constance, his wife, would not let him see the kids, but would send him like $3 a week. It was not much. His final months were spent in a dingy hotel in Paris. He wasn't really writing anymore. He was spending every penny he had on booze. He famously said, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has to go." Robert Ross, remember that young 17-year-old, was actually really faithful and stayed by his bedside kind of near to the end. And at the very end, he was conditionally baptized into the Catholic Church. And after he had not graduated from jail, after he was released from jail, he had tried to go to a sort of a Catholic retreat for the church. He had sort of found religion again and was devastated when they refused to let him come, right? He was not allowed to go. And then he died of meningitis. Wow. And there are people who take different stances on what caused that meningitis. It perhaps was syphilitic or caused from his ear injury. And then he was buried in Paris with and his tomb is still sort of a destination for people that are ostracized from culture or marginalized, right? People still sort of make the trek, and it's sort of a famous thing to do to kiss his statue. In fact, so much so was the problem, there was so much lipstick all over it that they now have a plastic fence around it that you can't.
Oh, really? They won't let people kiss it anymore?
Yeah.
It's kind of gross.
You can still kiss the window, but it's just not the same thing.
It's gross.
Yeah.
Have you been to...
I have not. That's one place that I haven't. I've always wanted to, but I think it's a little outside Paris. So whenever we go, it's a ways to get. Yeah,
bummer. It's kind of a bummer story.
Yeah, and the one thing that complicates things is that Oscar Wilde is, and I'm gonna try to stay as least controversial here as I can. Oscar Wilde is often touted as an LGBT hero, but I looked for the article again today. My understanding is that when he died, he had renounced his homosexual ways and was devastated that he had treated his wife in such a manner. So I really wish I had the direct quotes from him, because he had spoken about this and his ways as he was heading towards death. But I couldn't find the article again. I tried really hard, but I couldn't find it. So I don't think his attitude was that his lifestyle should be spread unconditionally, and that he had been abused. He was posthumously pardoned, like after Britain
the sodomy laws were revoked.
The sodomy laws were revoked, and then he was posthumously pardoned for what he had done.
Oscar Wilde is going to be, and currently is, kind of a figure that now is going to be kind of retconned into modern sensibilities about sexual ethics. And
but that's the thing, is he didn't have those sensibilities.
Exactly. Well, yeah. I mean, when we're talking 19th century conversations about attraction and sexual orientation, like they don't, in the 19th century, you don't have the category of homosexual that we do now, and say that it is an ontological sort of essence of a person like we do nowadays. And that's sort of an open, I find that a really fascinating debate. Just talking anyway. So we don't need to talk. I don't want to go
deep into it, but I do know that his views changed later in life.
But he is going to be. I think there's a movie coming out about his relationship with Lord. Is it Lord Antony? Lord Alfred. And it's, from the trailer that I watched, they're kind of setting it up as like, here's a sort of a proto hero of the Pride movement, and so here are all the ways that he was hard done by, and he was hard done by, and that's a tragic story. But it is kind of retconning the someone's. Is that the right word, Thomas?
Yep.
Yeah. It's sort of. I mean, it's when you're having sort of modern philosophies or modern sort of political. Not axis to grind, but you know what I mean.
Modern political sensibilities,
and then over sort of someone else's life in a different time. I mean, it's just it's too easy of a story now that's going to slip into a modern narrative. Anyway, but we're not going to try to do that. We're going to talk about
that's neither here nor there. But so let's move to his book. So The Picture of Dorian Gray. I'm going to give you guys the basic story, and then I might read a couple small spots of it, and then we will end with the introduction. I know that's a weird way to do it.
Backwards, I like this.
But doing things backwards, that's my plan. So the tale opens with Basil Hallward, the painter, and Lord Henry Wotton, the noble, and young Dorian Gray. And Basil Hallward is painting Dorian Gray. And so Dorian has to stand there. And this isn't the first time that Basil has painted Dorian. He's put him in other scenes as like characters and stuff. But this is a portrait specifically of Dorian for that moment. Yep. And so Basil kind of gets finished, and Lord Henry and Dorian go out into the yard, out into the little garden. And then we sort of go into this weird chapter 2, which is all philosophy, right? It's talking about, well, I'll have to get there. Let's see. You understand me? Best of all in this world. All right, so I'm going to give you a few instances of just the cleverness in this book. There's a reason I love it, and part of the reason I love it is because, man, quotable. No one could turn a phrase like Oscar Wilde could turn a phrase. I actually have a law. So you guys, we keep commonplace books, right? For new listeners, a commonplace book is where you record all the quotes that have had an influence on you or you think are interesting or you just want to write it down for later. I won't allow myself to take anything from the Picture of Dorian Gray because if I did, I would just have to rewrite the whole book because every third line is a quotation that you want to be like, ha, that's clever. You can put that on a bumper sticker, right? Half of them are. It's incredible.
Can I ask a minor aside, just because you brought up commonplace books? How many quotes should I be leaving a book with? Like in a normal book?
I mean, sometimes
that's a weird question.
I'm worried that I'm trying to take too much out of my books. So like I'll end with 40 or 50 like things I want to take out of them. Is that way too many?
I don't think so. It depends on the book, I guess.
Okay. That's it.
For me, I just write down when I see something good. Sometimes it'll be 1 or 2 if it's not a very quotable book. For Moby Dick, I had like 33 quotes. Okay. So it just depends. Okay. I'd say the quality changes things.
Cool.
So here's just a few quips. And you guys, this is the smallest, tiniest taste. I just kind of flip to a random page. You should read it if the only thing you are interested in is clever quips. Because, man, nobody quips clever like Oscar Wilde. So he says, conscience and cowardice are really the same things, Basil. Conscience is the trade name of the firm. That's all. Here's where they're talking about another woman. He's like, talking about Lady Brandon. He says, "You're not going to run away so soon, Mr. Howard," she screamed out. You know her curiously shrill voice. Yes, she is a peacock and everything but beauty, said Lord Henry, which is great.
That's good.
And then more about Lady Brandon. It says, but Lady Brandon treats her guests exactly as an auctioneer treats his goods. She either explains them entirely away or tells one everything about them except what one wants to know.
Good.
And then he goes, poor Lady Brandon, you are too hard on her, Harry, said Hallward listlessly. My dear fellow, she tried to found a salon and only succeeded in opening a restaurant.
Yeah.
How could I admire her? Right?
That's good.
Yeah, so it's quote after quote. And those aren't even the best ones. Like, again, that is just sort of a random page. All right, so they go out into the garden and they begin to discuss philosophy. And I'm going to give you a little bit of it.
Well, let's set up. Like, what is Dorian? How old is he? And Lord Henry?
So Dorian is like, maybe 20. Mm-hmm. And Lord Henry is just sort of a man about town who doesn't, what would you call him? A cynic?
Yeah, I mean, he's so Basil, Dorian, and Lord Henry are all kind of facets of Oscar Wilde himself. But he's sort of one of these guys that says outlandish and hilarious things with a wink in his eye and with a witty sort of quip. Lord Henry. And no one believes him. And he'll say sort of terrible things. And everyone's like, oh, Lord Henry, you're absolutely terrible. I can't believe you just said that terrible thing.
And they laugh about it.
And they also laugh about it. Ha, 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 ha. And, Lord Henry makes jokes about his wife. Like, oh, her and I, we just, as long as we don't tell each other about each other's affairs, and he means affairs like seeing other people, then we get along just fine. He's like that kind of, I don't know if it's cynical. He's very much that fin de siècle kind of
what?
Fin de siècle, the end of the 19th century. That sort of you don't know the phrase? Oh, okay. That's a longer podcast, I guess. But he's very much this sort of, he surrounds himself with beautiful things and doesn't take anything seriously. And there's probably like, if you scratch beneath the surface, there's probably like a giant pit of despair, but he keeps it covered.
We see it later.
You see it later, but he keeps it covered by sort of his foppish ways and his humorous phrases. But he has a profound effect on Dorian.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to get to right now. So this is like, usually when I read it for the first time with the seniors, they sort of gloss over this part because it's boring. There's no action, and there are fewer clever quips.
The first chapter or the
chapter 2?
Okay,
chapter 2, and continuing a little bit later in chapter 2. But this is where really the conversation that will turn Dorian's entire life, the course of his whole life, it'll redirect the river. This is that conversation, and it's easy to miss. So they go and they sit outside, and this is before they actually go out into the garden. So there's two parts of the conversation: one that happens while they're being painted, and then one in the garden. And then Dorian asks, "Have you really a very bad influence, Lord Henry? As bad as Basil says?" "There is no such thing as a good influence, Mr. Gray. All influence is immoral. Immoral from the scientific point of view. Why? Because to influence a person is to give him one's own soul. He does not think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. His virtues are not real to him. His sins, if there are such things as sins, are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of a part that has not been written for him. The aim of life is self-development, to realize one's nature perfectly. That is what each of us is here for. People are afraid of themselves nowadays. They have forgotten the highest of all duties, the duty that one owes to oneself. Of course, they are charitable. They feed the hungry and clothe the beggar, but their own souls starve and are naked. Courage has gone out of our race. Perhaps we never really had it. The terror of society, which is the basis of morals, the terror of God, which is the secret of religion, these are the two things that govern us. And yet, and then there's a little bit of banter with Basil, and yet, continued Lord Henry in his low musical voice and with that graceful wave of the hand that was always so characteristic of him and that he had even in his Eton days, I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every to every feeling, expression to every thought, reality to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies of medievalism and return to the Hellenic ideal, to something finer, richer than the Hellenic ideal it may be. But the bravest man amongst us is afraid of himself. The mutilation of the savage has its tragic survival in the self-denial that mars our lives. We are punished for our refusals. Every impulse that we strive to strangle broods in the mind and poisons us. The body sins once and has done with its sin, for action is a mode of purification. Nothing remains then but the recollection of a pleasure or the luxury of a regret. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with the longing for the things it has forbidden it to itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful. All right, and then he goes on. But that is the very beginning. So what pieces of philosophy did you guys catch in there?
I mean, so the essential, it's that the only way to sort of be an authentic self, or the sort of the duty that one has, is one's own self-development. And the way that one self-develops is to sort of drink deeply of beautiful things and experiences and let them affect you, and then authenticity. Sort of, it is a cry of that authenticity is the only good.
Yeah.
But not just authenticity, giving into impulses, right?
Yeah.
So every impulse you have, even if it's a sinful one, you can just indulge and then it goes away, right? Whereas if you leave it, that desire will sicken your mind. Even more so is, I think, important that he undercuts the notion of morality entirely. He says morality, which is, it's because we are afraid of our fellow men. And then the fear of, like, religion is just the fear of God. So both of those things are fear. And if you were truly bold, you would live out all of the impulses that you have. Yep. So that's a big thing for a young man in his 18 to 20 range to hear.
Yeah, it's a kind of a Nietzschean will to power kind of argument, where he's saying that the only thing that is important is your own experience and your own sort of going for it, and the truly admirable are those that follow the threads of curiosity even into the dark woods that everyone's told you not to go in, and that kind of thing. Right. So it's and this really is that basis of the aesthetic philosophy that Wilde had.
Yeah, this is the ground floor of aestheticism.
What's fascinating to me is that, like, Wilde lived that, but then this book is highly critical of
That's
it.
what I was going to say. Yeah, we'll get there, but the book contradicts that.
Yeah,
view.
that's the weird dichotomy, is that the life that Oscar lived was essentially this
Lord Henry.
philosophy. It was Lord Henry, which is so interesting. Okay, and then the second part of the philosophy that turns Dorian is when they talk about his youth. So he said, basically, he says, you shouldn't allow yourself to become sunburnt, Dorian. It's unbecoming. And then Dorian's like, what does it matter? Ha ha. And he says it should matter everything to you because you have the most marvelous youth, and youth is the one thing worth having. And he goes, I don't feel that, Lord Henry. And he says, no, you don't feel it now. Someday when you are old and wrinkled and ugly, when thought has seared your forehead with its lines and passion branded your lips with its hideous fires, you will feel it. You will feel it terribly. Now, wherever you go, you charm the world. Will it always be so? You have a wonderfully beautiful face, Mr. Gray. Don't frown, you have. And beauty is a form of genius, is higher indeed than genius, as it needs no explanation. It is of the great facts of the world, like sunlight, or springtime, or the reflection in dark waters of that silver shell we call the moon. It cannot be questioned. It has its divine right of sovereignty. It makes princes of those who have it. You smile. Ah, when you have lost it, you won't smile. People say sometimes that beauty is only superficial. That may be so, but at least it is not so superficial as thought is. To me, beauty is the wonder of wonders. It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. Yes, Mr. Gray, the gods have been good to you, but what the gods give, they quickly take away. You have only a few years in which to live really, perfectly, and fully. When your youth goes, your beauty will go with it. And then it goes on. Mm-hmm. Basically, you'll live, and the only thing you'll have left to you is the memory of your horrible defeats.
And Dorian freaks out, right?
Dorian,
he's bummed by all this.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he has just been told that there is no moral floor, and the best thing to do is to indulge. And also, your beauty that you have now and are enjoying so fully is going to disappear.
Yeah, you got a short window in which to do it, and then the rest of your life is buckle up for sadness.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and so then they go back in, and he sees the painting, and the painting is absolutely gorgeous, right? It's just been finished, and Basil's like, "Hey, do you like it?" And he's like, "How could I like it? I'm getting older, and it's gonna stay the same age." And so he gives this wild prayer that says, essentially, I would give my soul for it to be the other way around, for the painting to age and not me, for me to retain my youth. And what we find out later is that that's what happened. All right, we're butting up against my time window here, so I'm going to have to hustle a little bit through the plot.
Go for it.
And then I'll hit on some important stuff. So after that moment, after that wild prayer, we do find later that the painting has, it's come true. The painting will age, and he will not, and he retains his youth.
And not
beauty.
just age; it'll also take on his moral failing.
We'll get there.
Right.
So he in a moment he's going to fall in love with a woman named Sybil Vane, and Sybil Vane is an actress, and she's a great actress. And then he goes and visits her, and eventually he proposes to her, and they're going to get married. And then he brings all his friends, and then she is all of a sudden a terrible actress, and he doesn't know why. And it's because she has now felt real love, and so she can't fake it anymore. And he thinks, and he only really loved her for her art. And so he is like, you don't interest me anymore. And I'm like, the magic is totally gone, and leaves her. And he's been cruel, and he goes home and looks at sort of the painting, and the painting now has a twinge of the cruel.
He's so cruel, she kills herself.
Well, that's what he finds out the next morning, is he wakes up and he's feeling kind of bummed about it. And he's like, maybe I made the wrong decision. I'll go and make things right. And then he finds out that she has killed herself. And Lord Henry comes and twists it and said that what she lived was a beautiful tragedy, and that it's okay, right? What you've given her is a gift. She would have grown to be this old, listless, boring actress woman of the low class, and you have spared her, and you've essentially made her Juliet when she would have been so much less.
Is he the devil?
He...
Pretty much.
Yeah, the thing is he's so charming. Yeah. Lord Henry knows how to charm a room, but man, the stuff he says is horrible.
Yeah. And Dorian believes it, kind of. He feels bad about it, but he does sort of internalize that principle, and is like, yeah, I guess, these sort of tragedies are the things that are the spice of life. And
yeah, Henry knows, and there's a spot that I skipped. I call it the alchemist. It's where he knows that he toys with people to see their reactions. And so that through almost all of this, Henry is not sincere. He is messing with Dorian to see what happens.
Yeah, he sets himself as an alchemist or a scientist, and he just sort of drops these little phrases into people's lives to see how they work and to see how he can kind of get them to do things. He's kind of like a troll in that way. Like he's sort of insinuating things, and then people will go off and actually do these
stuff that he doesn't believe at all. In fact, Basil calls him on it all the time.
Yeah.
He's like, I don't think you mean half the stuff you say. Actually, you're a really good husband, at least for a while.
And then when it comes back to Lord Henry, they're like, Lord Henry, this is your fault. You're the one who said this. He's like, why? It wasn't the one that made him go and do these sorts of things. All I'm saying is just fancy nonsense.
So after this, we see Dorian's rise in culture and moral fall. So as he is getting more popular, he is degrading morally. And then eventually it gets so bad, and then rumors start to circulate about how terrible he is. But he's still so, and once you see his face, you just can't believe the stuff about him because he's still so beautiful.
And eventually, innocent and charming, like a little cherub.
Yeah. His friendship grows with Henry and falls with Basil. And eventually Basil comes and confronts him and says, I hear some horrible things about you, and I just can't believe them. Especially when I see your face. The stuff that I've heard will leave its mark, right? And he's like, well, you want to see what I actually look like? And takes him up and shows him the painting that has been growing more and more disgusting every day. There are blood on the hands from the death of Sybil. There's a weird, cruel twist of the face. It is old and graying, and it's just looking terrible. And Basil all of a sudden realizes what's going on and sort of despairs. And then all of a sudden, Dorian sort of gets disgusted with Basil and doesn't want a secret to get out, so he murders him as he sits there in the chair. And then he has to call in a blackmail to get a friend to come and dissolve the body in acid.
Yep.
Because It's never made clear what he knows about this guy.
Breaking Bad style.
But it is.
It is, yeah.
He pretty much says, I will out this secret about you, and you will have to live in infamy because of all this stuff
that's the section that's probably where they're insinuating homosexuality. The secret is that they had this love affair back in the day.
Right. That's the piece that's kind of there. After that, he's feeling pretty bad, understandably, after killing a guy.
Right.
So he decides to clean him, to clean the soul by means of the senses, right? And then he goes to an opium den. And in the opium den, he runs into, someone calls him by, Prince Charming? And then the brother of Sybil Vane, the actress, had been looking for him for years and years and had only heard him referred to by her as Prince Charming. So chases him down and is about to kill him. He's like, say your prayers because you killed my sister and I'm going to kill you. And he's like, how long ago did this happen? And the guy's like, I don't know, 10, 15 years? And he's like, look at my face.
Yeah.
And so they go under a street lamp and he looks like he's 20 years old. So he'd been like 5. And he's like, clearly it wasn't me that hurt your sister. And the guy is convinced and leaves. And then he goes back into the opium den and an old woman is like, he hasn't changed in 15 years. And so he's kind of set back on the trail. And then he's feeling real weird and bad, and then eventually he decides to go outside and get a little fresh air, and he goes with a hunting party, and one of the guys shoots a little wild and hits someone in the brush, and it turns out to be Sybil Vane's brother. So he's safe.
Yep.
He's ultimately safe from everything. His secrets are with him. Nobody knows about the painting.
Everyone's like,
anything.
whatever happened to Basil? He probably just was a grumpy artist that went to Paris.
Yeah, because he's really smart in the way that he conceals it. And then even among all this freedom, he still sort of despairs about where his soul is, goes up and looks at the painting and knows that, he thought for a while that the painting would be his conscience, that it would show him when he has done something wrong. And now it's just a picture of his absolutely degraded soul. So he takes a knife to it. And then the painting dies, and so does he. It's switched. The painting is immediately back to how it was originally beautiful. Then all of that horror is visited upon his body, and they don't even know who it is.
Yeah, the cops are like, who's this ugly old man?
Yeah, just some random old guy in this guy's house.
And then so all of it's been transposed back. So as soon as the painting gets stabbed, it goes back onto Dorian. He's this withered, ugly old man where the legacy of his sins are visited upon his body and his face, which is an interesting question to talk to kids about. Is like, do you think that's true? Do you think not just obviously a life of hard living in terms of substances will have its effect, but do you think if you live a morally degrading life that it is going to play itself out on your features?
Yeah, that's a fun question.
It's an interesting question.
I also think this is a great book to read for, I don't know if you guys had this experience, but growing up as a Christian, I was always like, if I only had one day to sort of do whatever I wanted to do and have no rules and experience it all with no repercussions.
It'd be awesome.
It'd be awesome. But that's what Dorian had. Yeah. He had a lifetime with no repercussions and
is miserable
and hates himself and hates his life and lives in this horrible vacuity, right, where nothing matters, right? His blue china will not make him feel better.
Right.
And so there's that. But the weird thing is that this is the life that Oscar Wilde lived. Yeah. Even after the publication of this book, he still lived the same life. So he must have either written it prior to having his attitudes changed, but I think it was even after he had met his young lover. And so it's just this weird tension between the real life of Oscar Wilde and what he has written in this tale. And that's not the only fun moral question that comes up, because one of the things that came up in his trial was, is this book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, a moral or immoral book? And Donaldson and I have been talking about this for a long time, but can a book be moral or immoral? And that's what brings us back to the introduction.
Yeah.
His preface. So I'm going to read you his preface. It's
just a bunch of quips.
So many lines. Yeah, and it's mostly just quips. So this is the preface to his second edition. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest as the lowest form of criticism is a mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. And here's the big one. There is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. And he would reiterate that during his trial. The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his face in a glass. The moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, but the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. Here's another important one. No artist desires to prove anything. Even things that are true can be proved. No artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. No artist is ever morbid. And this sort of goes on. I don't want to read the whole thing, but those are, I think, the important ones, right? No artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerisms of style. There's no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. And I've had this conversation, and I obviously play devil's advocate here in maintaining that no book is a moral thing. It is an artifact. The author who wrote it can be moral. The person who receives its message can be moral, but the book itself is a thing. Now, I had this conversation with a friend of mine, and he said, well, it depends on what your definition of moral is. And just like any philosophical conversation, it depends on definitions. If the definition is it encourages good things, well, then, of course, a book can encourage good things. I always associated moral in my mind with something that can take action. Only actions can be moral, and a man is a thing that can, take actions, right? Doing a thing can be moral or immoral. A book sitting on a shelf is not doing anything, and so it's not moral or immoral. It's just a great question. And I don't know that we have enough time to address it. But yeah, if we're to discuss influence, it can have certainly an immoral influence, but that's because the person is reacting in a certain way. You can read a book that encourages you to go steal things from old ladies. And if the way you react is saying, I would never do that, and that's deplorable, well, you're having it's actually influencing you towards the positive, right? You're having a good reaction to this book. So the book would, in that case, maybe be moral. It's just a weird thing. And I think the people at the trial certainly didn't agree with Oscar Wilde. They obviously thought books can be moral or immoral. Right. And that's an attitude I think that permeates the 1800s, especially the Victorian era. But I don't know, it's something to think about.
Yes, and we had this conversation a lot, just not on the podcast. Yeah. I fall more on the fact that books can be persuasive and that authors know what they're doing.
So the author is immoral.
And then that persuasion through the story ends up being... It's like the Jedi mind trick, right? Like, right. Okay, so maybe the super virtuous can be inoculated to it, but for those who aren't, for those who are swayable, and they get their hands on something that sways them.
It's like the movie Fight Club.
Yeah.
Kind of like that.
Yeah. Like that's a movie that's launched 1,000
like basement fight clubs.
And also just like sort of a pretty dark view of humanity.
Yeah.
But has sort of an element of sort of this persuasion to it. So yeah, things like that. Like that's do you ban it? I don't know. Do you put the author on trial? Probably not. At least they did in the 19th century. Although
is an author allowed to write something that he personally disagrees with, just to make you think about it?
Yeah, and So I know
in poetry, is that okay? Can I write a character that is convincing, but is, I think, the devil? Right? Is Lord Henry okay?
But the thing is, like, the book takes a moral stance. It's saying that Dorian's philosophy and viewpoint and Lord Henry's influence was a bad thing.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah. I'd say that if you're going to have to slot this book into moral or immoral, I would put it firmly in the moral category. Mm-hmm. But that's not to say that there aren't books out there that would go the other way.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's an interesting one.
It's an interesting one.
So anyway, something to think about, audience. If you have an opinion on whether or not books can be moral or immoral, you can sort of shoot us an email, and we'll try to get back to you if we can. It's near the end of time. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that there's a specific thing I wanted you guys to leave with. I want you to go read the book, partially because it's so interesting, especially considering the author's life. And man, it's just a
fun
hoot
to read. Yeah.
Like, it's just so fun to read.
It's not super long, so you can read it in a couple hours. Yeah, it's great. Anything else?
That's it for me.
Rock and roll. Cool. This has been Classical Stuff You Should Know. You can find us online at classicalstuff.net. You can email us at classicalstuff@veritasacademy.net. You can find us on Twitter at cliscalstuff. And hopefully by this point we've gotten that 100th review, but let's get that 1,000th.
Woo! Wow, that's a real uptick.
10x.
Let's go for it. Yeah, seriously, rock and roll. I think that's it. We never make mistakes, and we have no quotes. So
no classical stuff we got wrong. Yeah. I'm sure there is, though. Apparently I pronounce British things wrong.
I pronounce entrepreneur wrong.
I say you do.
Entrepreneur.
It's very funny. It's
Yep.
very,
It
very
was
funny.
very
And I
humorous.
kind of want to keep doing that. I feel like
Go
it's
for
a
it.
pretty little
Rock and
personal
roll.
quip.
You
Yep.
should make it
Nuclear.
worse and worse every time. All right, this is
Entrepreneur.
This is the worst. All right, this is Thomas, AJ, and Graham signing off.
Bye.